Chapter 1. A Dark Switch. Will stood across the empty field from Captain Mercer Caldrell, with fresh snow falling in the dead zone between their armed men. He was here to show his rebels that everything didn't have to dissolve into meaningless carnage on the freezing grass outside of Caelin. If he succeeded, Will could bring freedom to Rathos without the use of dead magic. "If you don't step forward, I will," Irvin said at his side. Will didn't look at his old friend, one of his first supporters in his fight. This was something Master Colwell had been waiting for, since he lost his family thanks to Caldrell's men many years ago. If he did gaze over at the slim rebel, with his typical violet tunic sleeves barely visible under his own iron armor, Will knew he'd see a fresh desire for revenge in his pale blue eyes. They had their differences, yes, especially lately, but Will still trusted Irvin. He would stick to what they had discussed for this meeting. Will moved across the icy earth. Irvin stayed at his side, with 3 rebel fighters at their backs. Directly in front of them, his men held the first piece of Will's plan, one of Caldrell's scouts, caught last night outside the rebel camp. Returning him to the Rathosian captain unharmed was something he wanted both armies to see. "I will not be the first to shed blood in this fight." Across the hilly expanse, Caldrell matched their move, with only one uniformed officer accompanying him. "You can hold there," declared the man, once there was only 10 feet between them. Fresh clouds issued from his lips and hung like warning shots. Will waited with his hands at his sides, nowhere near his weapons. He planned on letting Caldrell speak first. Behind the military magnet lay the sodden town of Caelin. Within the shroud of seaside mist, he could make out many blackened skeletons of buildings, homes burnt with their owners inside, for merely being suspected of bearing his rebel violet.
"Look at you,"
the captain exclaimed. His words burst through the tense air. He held his arms out, then raised them above his head and turned in a slow circle.
"I see before me an immature idealist, an old bitter hound, and a few northerners scrounged up in the snow. You may not want to shed blood right away. After marching for a month, I can't say the same for my men. You'd be short satisfying work for Rathosian soldiers."
"They will be facing fellow Rathosian soldiers, recently smart enough to join my cause, from Lorrington,"
Will input calmly. He took a step forward, enough to put one of his shoulders authoritatively in front of Irvin, who looked ready to tear at Caldrell's throat with his bare hands.
"We're here,"
Will continued,
"as agreed upon, to return this man to your ranks."
"You won't kill a lowly scout?"
the captain questioned, disbelievingly.
"After you invaded Lorrington and killed most of Moore's guardsmen, I assumed you were finished with this non-violent nonsense."
"I've gained more than half of Rathos under such methods,"
Will clarified with a shrug.
"I'm not stopping now."
"So you think you're going to peacefully advance, straight to the Bradford, and get what you want that way?"
When Caldrell posed the questions, the officer next to him swallowed a laugh.
"I'd like to try."
"Your companion there looks like he wants something else."
Irvin shifted from side to side, clearly trying to hold himself back. He managed to remain silent, as Will had instructed. Caldrell craned his neck forward, then tilted his head sharply to the left, till his ear touched the pressed shoulder of his uniform jacket.
"The last time I was in northern Rathos, I put a stop to a contagious illness in Patton. I can't remember. Did I get a thank you from you that day, Master Colwell?"
He bent forward at the waist, an odd angle for his body to take, as he paced to the left, then the right.
"No? Is that why you're here now?"
Caldrell stopped abruptly. So sudden was the movement that his boots snapped against the snowy ground. Within a breath, he straightened to attention and clasped his hands behind his back. The condescending, antagonizing tone that went with his unusual body language mutated with inhuman speed. Will put out an arm to stop Irvin from stalking forward. A bit of worry spiked in his chest.
"Oh, that's not it. No. You're here to see me scream."
Cauldrell whispered the words, then took 2 steps toward Will and his companions.
You want to taste the sweetest essence you can find in this life, to make another suffer as you have.
He inched forward, and now his voice sounded like that of a lover, barely restraining the urge to run into their soulmate's arms.
It's delicious, I promise you.
The captain's officer rushed up, hand on his weapon, as if suddenly aware of a threat of violence. Will saw his men touch their own swords out of the corner of his eye, and he held up a hand.
You're selling yourself short, Irvin scoffed, then spat toward the captain's feet. To make you suffer like I have would only be the beginning.
Of course. I'm so sorry.
Cauldrell smiled. The expression on his face was almost as disturbing as his words.
Sometimes I get carried away when I can smell revenge so close by.
He inhaled deeply in Irvin's direction. Will's stomach clenched. It took some effort to shove Irvin backward, making Will doubt that any of the man's anger was part of their performance.
What of your lieutenant?
Will asked, changing the subject.
Do you not care to know about your second-in-command I've kept as my prisoner?
Sarret,
Cauldrell jeered. He smacked his lips, as if contemplating whether he should try another bite of a questionable meal or spit the remnants at his feet.
So his mistress didn't use the poison I gave her. You should have put him down the minute you bested him. It was a waste, the time I spent creating him. And you, he added, finally giving the scout a bit of attention, you'd best come here.
The man shuffled eagerly across the space between the opposing forces. His expectant gaze never left Cauldrell, and he sighed when he reached his captain's side. The scout opened his mouth, though whether it was to utter an apology for getting caught or express gratitude for being returned alive, Will would never know. Cauldrell drew a knife from the belt around his uniformed waist. First, he shoved it into the center of the scout's stomach. When the man cried out and tried to double over, the captain grabbed his shoulder to keep him upright. His next stab was lower, 6 inches below the first, and this time he twisted the blade sharply. The officer beside Cauldrell stepped back with a blank expression. Will felt Irvin and his own men react, but he couldn't take his eyes off the captain's. Cauldrell didn't blink as he pulled his knife upward, connecting his 2 strikes along the scout's stomach while the man shrieked. Cauldrell pitched his soldier down at his feet, on top of a heap of his own entrails. While the sour scent of blood and acid filled the air, the captain casually put one of his thick leather boots on the back of the scout's head, forcing his face into the dirty snow as he writhed. Will's hands tightened into fists, clenched at his sides as he fought every impulse to leap forward. He couldn't move a muscle. He couldn't show any weakness. The precise, brutal actions took mere moments, and only a few more passed before the spy stopped moving. With a sniff, Cauldrell wiped his knife clean, resheathed it, and cleared his throat.
Master Will,
he began with a stone-cold glare,
you rebels will be reduced to nothing, just like this sorry bastard. Our Lord has many more world-changing concerns to address beyond you.
He is not our Lord,
Irvin countered. His voice was a well-reserved growl. Cauldrell snorted.
It's either his hand you bow toward, or the blood goddess's chains you wear. Now we know that I'm ultimately here to keep us safe from her.
Sybaris has never been part of my cause, Will replied strongly. And my rebels no longer have anything to fear from the goddess. We've broken her curse over Lorrington and refuse to be ruled either by her or your Bradford. You, however, should be very afraid.
Cauldrell forced a grin, one that Will guessed was supposed to be nonchalant. Then his gaze flickered to the trees over Will's shoulders. Will caught the small flash of trepidation in Cauldrell's eyes. Will grabbed Irvin's sleeve and kept him in place as the captain turned to leave. His officer followed, leaving the scout's body face down in the red snow. Back, toward the goddess's woods, Will trudged through the fresh piles of slick snow. To the right of the trees, headed east toward the rocky earth that descended to the sea, ranged hundreds of tents and thousands of men, all of them bearing Rebel Violet. He waited until he and Irvin entered the command tent, dismissing the men with them. Turning, Will faced his old friend. With a rough laugh, Irvin gave Will a brief hug, then collapsed in a chair.
You have no idea how difficult that was,
he sighed, reaching for the nearest drink cup and its remnants.
That man is absolutely—"
"I know," Will cut in, not wanting to dwell on the insane captain's behaviour. "You did well. I didn't think he'd strike down his own soldier, did you?" "Returning the scout as a show of good faith was your idea," Irvin shrugged. "It was important for all of our men to witness, I suppose, regardless of how it ended." Will tried to shake the sounds of the scout being gutted from his mind.
"Caldrell picked up what we wanted him to, though," he said.
"You think so?" Irvin scrutinized, his face wrinkled as he coughed past a mouthful of whiskey.
"I know it."
From the beginning, they never had a chance of outmanning the Rathosian army. Caldrell had too many men, raised since teenagers to obey him as their twisted commander. With half of the captain's forces still slowly making their way up the coastline to Caelin, the rebels had a small window of opportunity. Hiding many of their newly acquired soldiers in the cursed goddess's woods, and as many as possible in each tent in camp. Caldrell needed to see them as inexperienced, not a threat that needed fast elimination. They were a plaything that he could take his time with for his amusement. More importantly, he wanted Caldrell to report that the rebels had no idea what the Bradford was searching for: dead runes to cast an unthinkable spell to restore the core aspect of the goddess with an evil man at her side. What Sarret had confessed about his superior officer had sparked the start of Will's plans. Sarret himself was under guard at the back of camp. A little less guilt stung Will regarding what Irvin had done to Sarret, after Will had personally made sure Mayra and the man's children were safe. Since they had arrived at Caelin Field, Will had been going over every detail Irvin had forced out of Sarret, deciding how to best use the former lieutenant's knowledge. Caldrell's favoured tactics would be used against him, yet there was also the final confusing fact that Sarret divulged about the Bradford himself.
Sarret swore on his children's lives that our current lord never finished traditional training. Caldrell told Sarret it was disgraceful to the title to put someone, an unknown orphan, on Rathos' throne. He even went as far to say he knew that foreign hands had a role in placing this Bradford into power.
Though Sarret may prove useful on the battlefield, Will knew the man's brain had to be permanently addled by the Sama wine. That last bit of information made no sense, and could not be true. Irvin cleared his throat after setting down his empty glass.
"You sure spun that thread of wanting to talk with the Lord quite well," he commented. "I could practically see the desperation leaking from your eyes." "I'm sure he thinks I'm an idiot," Will replied. "And you, as the washed-up traitor only in it for himself, work nicely too."
Irvin opened his mouth, then shut it.
"I can't tell if I should be horribly offended or blushing with pride."
"Take your pick," Will chuckled, then sobered. "It'll be dark soon. Make sure the men continue to only light minimal lanterns." Irvin nodded. They'd been camped outside Caelin for several days, only letting out rotating groups of soldiers each night. During the day, to make their low numbers seem even worse, Will ordered many of them to stay within the trees.
"Now that I've set the stage, we'll strike Caldrell's forces tomorrow, before any of our surprise elements fall apart."
The command tent was the only bit of quiet sanctuary that Will allowed for himself. He risked one lantern when most of his updates arrived, leaving the other side of the tent, where several trunks and a pallet bed lay, in shadow behind a hanging blanket that created minimal privacy.
"I'll go remind them then,"
Irvin grunted as he stood. He paused, and Will braced himself.
"Is there any word on our lost lambs?"
Will shook his head. It had only been half a day since he'd gotten word that Devaki and Gardain were not in Lorrington anymore. No one knew where they'd gone, or why, and Will could only spare a scout or two to potentially look for them.
After all, he thought bitterly, the last thing she said when we got out of the dig site was "get away from me." I broke the last piece of her heart, after the two aspects of the goddess shattered it in Caladir. Devaki, without a doubt, hates me.
"They'll turn up soon," Irvin said from the tent's entrance. "The girl is smart, and so's that odd Gardain fellow. You'll see." Will grunted, though he wasn't sure if Irvin heard him as he left. The bustle of the rebel fighters quieted, and the smell of nighttime oil filled the air. Will shut his eyes and put a hand over his heart. Beneath his armour, tucked in the inner pocket of his thick woolen tunic, was a smooth piece of black stone. The dead rune in his possession pulled at him when he wasn't distracted, begging him to take it out,
cut its shape into his skin, sacrifice a full human offering of blood to its mother, and receive intense power at his fingertips.
Find the rest of them before the Bradford, and submit to Sybaris, to gain all I've ever wanted through serving her.
That tempting idea was dismissible when Will remembered what keeping the stone had done to his daughter. He was, ultimately, fighting this war for her, to set Rathos free so he could be with his child, whom he couldn't even see for the first 16 years of her life. The second thought that plagued him as soon as his day ended was Angeline. His time with her in Lorrington had been more than he'd ever thought his heart capable of after losing Isaka. But what she'd withheld from him during moments when he'd shared his deepest trauma hurt him deeply. To feel so betrayed when he'd betrayed another was complicated. Did he have a right to that pain? Angeline was back along their supply line, making sure rations were distributed and communication was open, with Lorrington a day's ride away. That meant being the connection point between Marcel's spies, working to delay the rest of the captain's forces down the coast. Will had not seen Angeline since they made camp. It was better to focus on what he could control, and that meant implementing his next step in defeating Coldrell.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.